The Bell device. In 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Nazi Germany, a covert American intelligence unit stumbled upon something buried beneath a concrete facility in Lower Silesia. The structure was unlike anything they had encountered: reinforced walls over 6 feet thick, ceiling mounted with ceramic hooks, and a chamber floor stained with a dark residue that resisted all attempts at chemical analysis. Local witnesses, terrified and reluctant to speak, referred to it only as Die Glock, the bell. According to declassified interrogation reports and fragmentary Nazi documentation recovered from the site, the bell was a metallic object roughly 9 feet wide and 12 feet tall, shaped like a large industrial bell. It consisted of 2 counter-rotating cylinders filled with a violet-colored mercury-like substance codenamed Zerum 525. When activated, the device emitted a pale blue glow and produced a high-pitched hum that caused severe nausea and disorientation in anyone nearby. The project was allegedly overseen by SS General Jakob Sporenberg and staffed by Germany's top physicists, many of whom died under mysterious circumstances during testing. Witness testimony claimed that the bell was tested on plants, animals, and potentially human subjects, all of which decomposed into a blackish sludge within hours of exposure. The biological effects were so severe that the test chamber had to be hosed down after every activation, and several technicians reportedly died from prolonged exposure to its unknown radiation. But what made the bell truly disturbing was its purported function. Nazi scientists believed they had created a device capable of manipulating gravitational fields and possibly even time itself. Internal documents referenced anti-gravity propulsion and temporal distortion, concepts that should have been purely theoretical in 1945. Some researchers have speculated that the bell was an attempt to create a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon that could alter the outcome of the war by literally bending the fabric of space-time. When American forces arrived, the facility had been hastily abandoned. The bell itself was gone. Burn marks on the ceiling hooks suggested it had been suspended and recently removed. The concrete floor bore deep grooves, as if something impossibly heavy had been dragged away. Local reports claimed that a massive transport convoy had moved through the area days before liberation, heading toward an airfield near the Czech border. What happened next remains one of the most suppressed stories of the post-war era. The facility was demolished by Army engineers within 72 hours. Photographic evidence was classified. Scientists who worked on the project either disappeared or were killed under suspicious circumstances, some in staged suicides, others in unexplained accidents. General Sporenberg was captured, tried for war crimes, and executed in 1952. But his testimony regarding Die Glock was sealed and remains classified to this day. Decades later, researchers discovered something even more troubling. Advanced metallurgical tests conducted on residue samples from the chamber revealed isotopic signatures that did not match any known natural or man-made process from that era. The conclusion was inescapable. Whatever the bell was, it operated on principles of physics that we still do not fully understand. If Nazi Germany had succeeded in weaponizing whatever force the bell generated, the war might never have ended. And if the technology fell into the hands of another power after 1945, then somewhere, hidden in a black-budget facility, that research may still continue. The Foo Fighters. In late 1944, Allied bomber crews flying night missions over Germany began reporting something impossible. Small luminous spheres glowing red, white, or orange appeared alongside their aircraft, matching their speed and maneuvers with unnerving precision. The objects showed no visible means of propulsion, emitted no exhaust, and seemed to defy the laws of physics as they accelerated, decelerated, and changed direction instantaneously. Pilots dubbed them Foo Fighters, borrowing from a comic strip phrase, but there was nothing funny about the encounters. At first, crews assumed they were seeing new German anti-aircraft technology, perhaps radio-controlled incendiary devices or experimental proximity weapons, but the objects never attacked. They simply followed, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for entire missions, maintaining perfect formation regardless of evasive maneuvers. Gunners fired thousands of rounds at them with no effect. The spheres absorbed bullets, ignored flak, and continued their silent surveillance. Military intelligence was baffled. Reports flooded in from bomber groups across multiple theaters, not just over Germany, but also over Japan and the Pacific. The phenomenon was consistent, glowing orbs, intelligent behavior, impossible flight characteristics. Debriefings were conducted, but pilots were warned not to discuss the sightings publicly. The official explanation offered was ball lightning or street Elmo's fire, but veteran airmen knew better. Ball lightning doesn't follow aircraft for 50 miles. It doesn't respond to changes in altitude or course. What made the Foo Fighters even more disturbing was the physiological effect they had on aircrews. Pilots reported sudden equipment malfunctions when the objects came close, compasses spinning wildly, radios emitting static bursts, engines momentarily cutting out. Some crews experienced inexplicable headaches, disorientation, and a sensation described as pressure inside the skull. Medical examinations found no physical cause, yet the symptoms were consistent across dozens of independent reports. By early 1945, Allied intelligence began to suspect that the Foo Fighters were not weapons at all, but reconnaissance devices, possibly unmanned drones using technology far beyond anything either side possessed. The implications were staggering. If Germany had developed autonomous aircraft capable of matching Allied bombers at high altitude, it represented a technological leap that defied all known engineering principles. But if the objects weren't German, then who built them? After the war ended, the sightings stopped. Completely. No Foo Fighters were reported after May 1945. No wreckage was ever recovered. No German scientists came forward claiming knowledge of the project. It was as if the phenomenon had simply switched off the moment hostilities ceased. Declassified documents from the 1990s revealed that both American and British intelligence had collected over 2,000 reports of Foo Fighter encounters during the war. Each report was filed, analyzed, and then buried in classified archives. When researchers attempted to access the full files, they discovered that key sections had been redacted or were missing entirely. Technical analyses, witness drawings, and photographic evidence, if any existed, had been removed. The most chilling detail came from a former RAF intelligence officer who spoke anonymously in 2003. He claimed that during the final months of the war, Allied command received intercepts, indicating that German pilots were reporting identical phenomena. The Foo Fighters were following Luftwaffe aircraft too. Whatever they weren't taking sides. If the Foo Fighters were surveillance drones, then someone was watching both sides of the war with technology that remains unexplained 80 years later. And if they weren't drones, if they were something else entirely, then the question becomes even more unsettling. What were they? And where did they go? The Nazi Antarctic base. In 1938 and 39, Nazi Germany launched 2 expeditions to Antarctica under the command of Captain Alfred Richer. Officially, the mission was to scout whaling territories and establish territorial claims in a region called Neuschwabenland New Swabia. The expeditions deployed aircraft that dropped thousands of metal swastika markers across hundreds of thousands of square miles of ice. But that was the public story. Declassified intelligence reports and testimony from German naval officers suggest something far more ambitious was underway. According to these accounts, the Nazis discovered a network of geothermal caves beneath the ice-fast subterranean chambers warmed by volcanic activity, some large enough to house entire complexes. The location was ideal for a secret research facility, remote, inaccessible, and invisible to aerial reconnaissance. By 1943, as the war turned against Germany, rumors began circulating within the Kriegsmarine that critical assets were being relocated to a base codenamed Base 211, or New Berchtesgaden. Submarine activity in the South Atlantic increased dramatically during the final months of the war. U-boats that should have been engaging Allied convoys were instead making long-range voyages toward the Antarctic coast. Several were reported missing after departing Norwegian ports with unusually heavy cargo and civilian passengers, scientists, engineers, and technical specialists. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, 2 German submarines, U-530 and U-977, surfaced in Argentina months later, long after hostilities had ended. The crews were interrogated by Allied intelligence, and their testimonies were bizarre. They claimed to have been ordered on a classified mission to transport high-value cargo to a secure location, then instructed to scuttle their vessels and surrender only after a predetermined date. When pressed about their destination, both captains provided vague and contradictory answers. Their logbooks had been destroyed. What happened next is a matter of historical record. though its full significance remains obscured. In late 1946 and early 47, the United States launched Operation High Jump, the largest Antarctic expedition in history. Officially described as a scientific and training mission, the operation involved over 4,000 personnel, 13 ships, and multiple aircraft. It was led by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, a decorated polar explorer. The mission was planned to last 6 to 8 months. It was abruptly terminated after only 8 weeks. Official reports cited severe weather and equipment failures, but this explanation satisfied no one. Antarctic expeditions routinely endure harsh conditions. That was the entire point of the training mission. What could have caused such a sudden withdrawal? Byrd's post-mission statements were carefully worded. In a press interview in Chile, he allegedly warned that the United States needed to prepare defenses against enemy fighters capable of flying from pole to pole. The quote was later disputed, redacted from official records, and dismissed as a misinterpretation. But the original Chilean newspaper report still exists. Declassified documents from the 1990s revealed that military intelligence had indeed been tracking reports of a possible enemy holdout in Antarctica. The files contained references to advanced technology, subterranean facilities, and potential threats to hemispheric security. But the critical details, locations, evidence, outcomes were redacted or missing entirely. If the Nazis truly established a base in Antarctica, and if that base housed experimental weapons or research too dangerous to be captured, it would explain the urgency and scale of Operation High Jump. It would also explain why the mission ended so abruptly, and why its findings were buried so deeply. The technology housed in those ice caves might have been deemed too destabilizing to reveal even to defeat. To this day, large sections of Antarctic territory remain restricted or inadequately surveyed. Satellite imagery of certain regions is strangely degraded or unavailable. What lies beneath the ice in New Schwabenland is still, officially, unknown. The Hortenho 229 stealth fighter. In March 1944, deep within a forested region near Göttingen, Germany, a team of Luftwaffe engineers supervised the first test flight of an aircraft that would not be replicated by any nation for another 40 years. The Hortenho 229 was a jet-powered flying wing, a design so advanced that it predated the American B-2 stealth bomber by nearly half a century. But what made it truly revolutionary was not its shape. It was what the shape concealed. The Ho 229 was designed by brothers Reimar and Walter Horten, two self-taught aviation prodigies who believed that traditional aircraft design was fundamentally flawed. They rejected the conventional fuselage and wing structure in favor of a seamless, blended wing body, a shape that minimized drag, maximized lift, and, crucially, reduced radar cross-section to almost nothing. The aircraft had no tail, no protruding features, and a smooth composite skin made from wood and carbon, bonded with glue that contained charcoal dust and sawdust. This mixture was not decorative. It was radar absorbent. When the Ho 229 flew, it did so in near silence compared to conventional fighters. Its twin Junkers Jumo turbojets gave it a top speed exceeding 600 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter of the time. Its range exceeded 1,000 miles, and its payload capacity allowed it to carry 2,000 pounds of bombs or air-to-air weaponry. In terms of raw performance, it was untouchable. But the most terrifying aspect was its invisibility. Wind tunnel tests and later reconstructions confirmed that the Ho 229's radar signature was roughly 80% smaller than that of contemporary aircraft. At certain angles, it was effectively undetectable by the radar systems used by Allied forces in 1944. If deployed in numbers, these aircraft could have struck deep into British airspace without warning, bypassing early detection networks and delivering devastating attacks with impunity. German high command recognized the potential immediately. Plans were drawn up for mass production, factories were retooled, pilots were trained. By early 1945, prototypes had completed successful test flights, and the first production models were being assembled. Then, inexplicably, the program was halted. Allied forces advancing into Germany in April 45 discovered the Horten facility partially destroyed. Most of the prototypes had been sabotaged or dismantled. Technical drawings were missing. The few remaining airframes were incomplete. American intelligence officers seized what was left and shipped it back to the United States under Operation Paperclip, the secret program to acquire German scientific assets. One intact Ho-229 prototype ended up at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, where it sat in storage for decades. It wasn't publicly acknowledged until 1982, and even then, its full specifications were classified. In 2008, a team of engineers from Northrop Grumman, the company that built the B-2 bomber, analyzed the Horton design using modern radar simulation software. Their conclusion was stunning. The Ho-229 would have been almost invisible to British chain-home radar systems. If Germany had fielded this aircraft in operational numbers even 6 months earlier, the outcome of the air war over Europe might have been drastically different. But the Horton brothers were not allowed to continue their work after the war. Reimer Horton was detained, interrogated, and then quietly released with no fanfare. He lived the rest of his life in Argentina, rarely speaking about the Ho-229. Walter Horton remained in Germany but was prohibited from working on aviation projects. Both men took their deepest secrets to the grave. The suppression of the Ho-229 wasn't about hiding failure, it was about concealing success. If the world knew that Nazi Germany had developed functional stealth technology in 1944, it would have shattered the post-war narrative that Allied air superiority was built on technological dominance. It would have revealed that the margin of victory was far narrower than anyone wanted to admit. Worse, it would have exposed a troubling question. How much of that technology was quietly absorbed into American and Soviet programs after the war? The B-2 bomber, unveiled in 1989, bears an uncanny resemblance to the Horton design. Coincidence? Or inheritance? The Pentagon has never commented. The Japanese death ray. In the summer of 1943, while American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, Japanese scientists working in a secret laboratory on the outskirts of Tokyo completed the first successful test of a weapon that should not have existed. Designated the Kugo Project, it was officially described as a directed energy research program. In reality, it was an attempt to build a weapon capable of killing enemy pilots from miles away using nothing but focused electromagnetic radiation. The concept was deceptively simple. Generate a powerful microwave beam, focus it with precision, and direct it at an aircraft cockpit. The radiation would heat the pilot's body tissue, causing immediate incapacitation, seizures, burns, unconsciousness, or death without damaging the aircraft itself. No bullets, no explosives, just an invisible wave of energy that turned human bodies into targets. According to declassified interrogation reports obtained from Japanese scientists after the war, the Kugo device used a magnetron, an early microwave generator similar to the technology later used in radar systems and, eventually, household microwave ovens. But the Japanese version operated at far higher power levels, focused into a narrow beam by a parabolic reflector nearly 10 feet across. When activated, the device emitted a continuous microwave pulse strong enough to heat water at a distance of several hundred yards. Initial tests were conducted on animals, rabbits, dogs, and monkeys placed in metal cages positioned downrange from the emitter. The results were grotesque. Witnesses reported that subjects exposed to the beam began convulsing within seconds. Their body temperatures spiked rapidly. Internal organs began to cook from the inside out. Death occurred in under a minute. Autopsies revealed tissue damage consistent with severe burns, but there were no external marks. The killing was invisible. Encouraged by these results, project leaders proposed field testing the weapon against actual aircraft. A prototype was constructed at a coastal site near Kamakura and aimed at the flight path of American B-29 bombers conducting nighttime raids over Tokyo. According to one engineer's testimony, the device was activated during at least 3 raids in late 1944. In each instance, Allied bomber formations reported sudden equipment malfunctions and physiological distress among crew members, dizziness, nausea, intense heat sensations, but no direct casualties were confirmed. Why the weapon failed to achieve its intended lethality remains unclear. Some researchers believe the power output was insufficient to penetrate aircraft fuselages at operational range. Others suggest that atmospheric conditions scattered the beam, reducing its intensity. A more disturbing theory proposes that the weapon did work, but its effects were masked by the chaos of air raids. Pilots attributed symptoms to stress, altitude sickness, or battle fatigue rather than an invisible energy weapon. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, American occupation forces conducted sweeps of Japanese military research facilities. The Ku-go project was among the discoveries. Technical documents, prototypes, and several of the lead scientists were seized and transferred to the United States under what would become Project Paperclip's Pacific equivalent. The scientists were interrogated extensively, then quietly integrated into American research programs, some reportedly working on radar and communications technology, others on classified defense projects. The Japanese death ray itself was dismantled and shipped to a military research facility in Maryland, where it reportedly underwent analysis by Army engineers and scientists from Bell Labs. After that, the trail goes cold. No public record of the device exists. Requests filed under the Freedom of Information Act have returned only heavily redacted pages citing national security exemptions. The few documents that have surfaced reference directed energy research and experimental microwave systems, but provide no technical details. What makes the Ku-go project so unsettling is not just that it worked, but that its principles are sound. Modern militaries possess directed energy weapons far more powerful than anything Japan built in 1943. Active denial systems, used for crowd control, operate on the same basic concept. Focused microwaves that cause intense pain without permanent injury. The technology evolved. It was never abandoned. It was perfected. If the Japanese had succeeded in deploying the Ku-go weapon operationally, air warfare would have changed overnight. Bomber crews, already vulnerable to flak and fighters, would have faced an invisible threat they couldn't evade, outrun, or armor against. Every mission would have been a gamble. Every sky, a potential death zone. The program was shut down not because it failed, but because it succeeded just enough to terrify everyone who understood its potential. The Soviet sound cannon. In the winter of 1942, as German forces besieged Leningrad and advanced toward Stalingrad, Soviet military engineers working in a fortified bunker beneath the Ural Mountains completed construction of a weapon unlike anything seen in modern warfare. Designated Project Thunder, it was designed to incapacitate enemy troops without firing a single bullet. The device generated focused acoustic waves, pure sound at frequencies and intensities capable of disrupting human physiology at ranges exceeding 500 yards. The concept originated from research conducted by Soviet physicist Vladimir Gavro, who had studied the effects of infrasound sound waves below the threshold of human hearing on biological systems. His experiments revealed something deeply disturbing. Certain low-frequency sound waves could cause involuntary muscle spasms, nausea, disorientation, loss of bowel control, and in extreme cases, cardiac arrest. The human body, it turned out, was vulnerable to acoustic resonance in ways that conventional weapons could not exploit. The Soviet sound cannon consisted of a massive parabolic reflector mounted on a reinforced platform, behind which sat an array of pneumatic compression chambers. When activated, these chambers released synchronized bursts of compressed air that generated low-frequency pressure waves. The reflector focused these waves into a tight beam that could be aimed like a searchlight. The frequency was tuned to approximately 19 Hz just below the threshold of conscious hearing, but perfectly aligned with the resonant frequency of human eyeballs and internal organs. According to testimony from scientists involved in the project, initial tests were conducted on condemned prisoners, political dissidents, and captured German soldiers placed at varying distances from the emitter. The results were immediate and horrifying. Subjects exposed to the beam at close range collapsed within seconds, vomiting, bleeding from the ears, and losing consciousness. At moderate distances, they experienced severe vertigo, temporary blindness, and uncontrollable tremors. Even at maximum range, the effects were debilitating. Subjects reported intense pressure in the chest, difficulty breathing, and an overwhelming sense of dread. One scientist's account, leaked decades later, described a test where the device was aimed at a group of 20 prisoners standing in formation. When the sound cannon activated, the men did not immediately collapse. Instead, they began moving in strange, uncoordinated ways. Some dropped to their knees, others staggered in circles, a few clutched their heads and screamed. Within 30 seconds, all 20 were on the ground, incapacitated. Several never recovered. Autopsies revealed ruptured blood vessels in the brain, fluid in the lungs, and hemorrhaging in the eyes. Soviet high command was intrigued but cautious. The weapon's potential was undeniable, but it presented serious operational challenges. The device was large, immobile, and required significant power to operate. More troubling was the fact that the acoustic beam could not distinguish between friend and foe. Soviet troops positioned too close to the target zone would suffer the same effects as the enemy. Deployment scenarios were limited, and the risk of friendly fire incidents was unacceptably high. By mid-1943, plans for field deployment were shelved. The official explanation cited technical limitations and logistical concerns. But internal memos suggest a darker reason. Soviet leadership feared that if the device fell into German hands, it could be reverse-engineered and used against Soviet forces. The technology was simply too dangerous to risk. After the war ended, the sound cannon project was quietly dismantled. Equipment was destroyed, facilities were repurposed, and scientists were reassigned to conventional weapons research. Most were forbidden from discussing their work. A few who violated this order disappeared into the Gulag system. Documentation was either burned or locked in classified archives that remain sealed to this day. Western intelligence agencies learned of Project Thunder through defectors and captured documents in the early 1950s. The CIA's technical assessment, declassified in 2006, confirmed that the Soviet device was theoretically viable and potentially scalable. The report recommended immediate research into acoustic weaponry for defensive and offensive applications. Within a decade, American researchers were conducting their own experiments with infrasound and sonic crowd control devices. Today, acoustic weapons are publicly acknowledged. Long-range acoustic devices, or LRADs, are used by military and law enforcement worldwide. They emit high-frequency sound waves that cause pain and disorientation without permanent injury. The technology has evolved, miniaturized, and sanitized for public consumption. But the lineage is clear. It traces back to a Soviet bunker in 1942, where engineers discovered that sound could be turned into a weapon more terrifying than bullets. If Project Thunder had been deployed at Stalingrad or Kursk, entire German battalions could have been neutralized without a shot fired. Enemy troops would have collapsed in agony, unable to fight, unable to flee. The psychological impact alone would have been devastating. Soldiers facing an invisible force that liquefied their insides would have broken before the first engagement. The weapon was buried not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well, and because those who understood its power knew that some technologies should never leave the laboratory. The German sarin gas artillery shell. In early 1945, as Allied armies closed in on Berlin from both east and west, a trainload of artillery shells was discovered in a warehouse near the Diehenfurth chemical plant in German-occupied Poland. The shells were marked with unusual color codes and handling warnings. When American chemical warfare specialists examined them, they made a discovery that would remain classified for over 30 years. The shells were filled with sarin nerve gas, a compound so lethal that a single drop on exposed skin could kill within minutes. Germany had developed sarin in 1938, years before any Allied nation even knew such a substance existed. It belonged to a class of organophosphate compounds designed to disrupt the nervous system by inhibiting the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. Without this enzyme, nerve signals become uncontrolled, causing convulsions, respiratory failure, and death. Sarin was colorless, odorless, and invisible, a perfect weapon for mass casualties. By 1943, German chemists had produced thousands of tons of sarin and stockpiled it in secure facilities across the Reich. They had also developed delivery systems, aerial bombs, artillery shells, and even experimental rockets designed to disperse the agent over wide areas. If deployed, a single sarin barrage could have rendered entire sectors of the battlefield uninhabitable and killed tens of thousands of soldiers before they even knew they were under attack. Yet Germany never used it. Not at Normandy, not at the Bulge, not even during the final desperate defense of Berlin, when defeat was inevitable. Why? The question has puzzled historians for decades, and the answer reveals something chilling about the nature of deterrence and mutually assured destruction. Allied intelligence had learned of Germany's chemical weapons capability as early as 1943 through captured documents and interrogations. In response, the United States and Britain quietly accelerated their own chemical warfare programs and made it clear through diplomatic channels via neutral countries that any use of nerve agents would trigger immediate and overwhelming retaliation. Allied bombers, it was implied, would carpet German cities with mustard gas, phosgene, and whatever new horrors Allied chemists had developed. But there was another layer to the deterrence. According to declassified intelligence reports, senior Nazi officials, including Hitler himself, were convinced that the Allies possessed nerve agents equal to or superior to Germany's own stockpile. This belief was based on disinformation deliberately planted by Allied intelligence operatives. The truth was that the United States and Britain had no nerve agents remotely comparable to sarin in 1943. The threat was a bluff, and it worked. Germany held its nerve gas in reserve as a weapon of last resort, convinced that deploying it would invite apocalyptic retaliation. The Allies, meanwhile, prepared for the worst, but prayed the bluff would hold. Both sides stood at the edge of chemical annihilation, and both blinked. After the war, Allied forces seized Germany's entire chemical arsenal, tens of thousands of tons of sarin, tabun, and soman. The shells, bombs, and production equipment were cataloged, studied, and then quietly disposed of. Most were dumped into the ocean or buried in remote locations. Some were transported to American and British research facilities for analysis. A handful of German chemists, including those who had developed the nerve agents, were recruited under Operation Paperclip and integrated into Western chemical warfare programs. The public was told nothing. For years, the existence of Nazi nerve agents remained classified. When the truth finally emerged in the 1970s, the revelations were sanitized and downplayed. Official histories emphasized Germany's restraint and the successful deterrence by Allied threats. What they omitted was how close the world came to a chemical holocaust, and how fragile the deterrence actually was. The most disturbing detail came from post-war interrogations of German officers. Several independently confirmed that in the final weeks of the war, as Soviet forces approached Berlin, there were serious discussions within the Nazi high command about deploying sarin against Red Army units. The plan was ultimately rejected, not out of moral considerations, but because German forces lacked the infrastructure to deliver the agent effectively, and because they feared Soviet retaliation would be even more brutal. If Germany had used sarin at Stalingrad, or during the Normandy invasion, or in the skies over Britain via V-2 rockets, the death toll would have been incalculable. Entire Allied divisions could have been wiped out before medics even understood what they were dealing with. The war might have dragged on for years, with both sides deploying ever more horrific chemical weapons in a spiral of escalation that would have left Europe uninhabitable. The sarin shells were not used, because their very existence created a balance of terror. Both sides possessed the means to commit mass atrocities, and both understood that crossing that line would guarantee mutual destruction. It was, in essence, the First Cold War. A standoff maintained, not by treaties or diplomacy, but by the shared knowledge of apocalyptic capability. The shells that were discovered in 1945 were quietly destroyed. The reports were classified. The scientists who built them were absorbed into new programs. And the world moved on, never fully understanding how close it came to chemical annihilation. The V-3 supergun. In the coastal hills of northern France, buried beneath 50 feet of reinforced concrete, German engineers constructed one of the most ambitious artillery weapons ever conceived. The V-3, also known as the Hochdruckpumpe, or high-pressure pump, was designed to bombard London from a distance of over 90 miles, far beyond the range of any conventional artillery piece. It was not a rocket, not a missile, but a gun. A gun so massive, so powerful, and so technically advanced that it should not have been possible to build with 1943 technology. The V-3 consisted of a series of smooth-bore barrels, each over 400 feet long, angled at 50 degrees toward the sky. Unlike traditional artillery, which relied on a single explosive charge to propel a shell, the V-3 used staged propulsion. As the projectile traveled up the barrel, it passed a series of side chambers, each containing additional explosive charges. These charges detonated in sequence, progressively accelerating the shell to speeds exceeding 5,000 feet per second. The result was a weapon capable of firing a 300-pound shell, nearly 100 miles, with enough velocity to penetrate fortified structures. German engineers planned to install 50 barrels at the site in Mimolles, France, arranged in 5 clusters of 10. At full operation, the installation could theoretically fire 600 shells per hour directly into central London. The psychological and physical impact would have been devastating, an unending rain of high-explosive shells arriving without warning, day and night, for as long as Germany could supply ammunition. Construction began in 1943 and proceeded under extreme secrecy. Thousands of slave laborers from concentration camps were used to excavate the tunnels and pour concrete. The facility was designed to be bomb-proof, with walls over 15 feet thick and multiple layers of steel reinforcement. German planners believed the site could withstand any aerial attack. They were wrong. Allied intelligence, tipped off by French resistance fighters and aerial reconnaissance photographs, identified the construction site by mid-1944. The target was assigned to the Royal Air Force's elite 617 Squadron, the famous Dam Busters, equipped with massive tallboy bombs designed by engineer Barnes Wallis. On July 6, 1944, the squadron attacked Mimoyex with precision strikes, dropping 12,000-pound tallboy bombs directly onto the facility. The results were catastrophic for the German project. One bomb penetrated the concrete shell and detonated inside the tunnel complex, collapsing entire sections and killing dozens of workers. Subsequent raids inflicted further damage, rendering the site unusable. By September, the project was officially abandoned. The barrels that had been installed were dismantled, and plans for additional V3 installations were shelved. After the war, Allied engineers inspected the ruins of Mimoyex and were stunned by what they found. The level of engineering sophistication far exceeded anything they had anticipated. Calculations based on recovered blueprints confirmed that the V3, if completed, would have functioned as designed. The staged propulsion system worked. The barrels could have delivered shells to London with devastating accuracy. What made the discovery even more troubling was the realization that Germany had been developing the V3 concurrently with the V1 flying bomb and the V2 rocket. All three weapons represented entirely different technological approaches to the same strategic objective: the destruction of London. The V3 was the most ambitious and in some ways the most terrifying. Unlike the V1 and V2, which required advanced electronics and guidance systems, the V3 was purely mechanical. It was a brute force solution that could be scaled, replicated, and deployed along Germany's Atlantic Wall, targeting not just London but any Allied city within range. Declassified documents from the 1980s revealed that after the war, both the United States and Soviet Union experimented with supergun technology based on German designs. The most infamous example was Iraq's Project Babylon in the 1980s, a supergun designed by Canadian engineer Gerald Bull, who had studied German wartime research. Bull's project aimed to build a gun capable of launching satellites into orbit, a dual-use technology with clear military applications. Bull was assassinated in 1990, and the project was dismantled. Many believe his work was shut down precisely because it threatened to revive a technology the world had agreed to suppress. The V3 represented a form of warfare that was both ancient and futuristic artillery elevated to a strategic weapon. If Germany had completed even one functional battery, London would have endured a bombardment unlike anything in history. No air raid sirens could warn of incoming shells traveling faster than sound. No shelters could protect against 300-pound projectiles arriving every few seconds. The city would have been pounded into submission. The weapon was stopped not because it failed, but because Allied intelligence and air power intervened just in time. A few more months of construction, and the V3 would have been operational. The course of the war and the fate of London would have been very different. The Japanese balloon bombs. In November 1944, residents of rural Montana discovered a large, deflated balloon tangled in a barbed wire fence. The object was made of washi paper, traditional Japanese mulberry fiber, reinforced with paste made from konnyaku root. Attached to it was a complex mechanism consisting of altitude sensors, sand ballast bags, and an incendiary device. American authorities were baffled. How did a Japanese weapon end up in Montana, over 5,000 miles from the nearest Japanese-controlled territory? The answer was Project Fugo, one of the most innovative and unsettling weapons programs of the Pacific War. Between November 1944 and April 1945, Japan launched approximately 9,300 fire balloons, hydrogen-filled devices designed to drift across the Pacific Ocean on high-altitude jet streams and detonate over the United States and Canada. Each balloon carried either high-explosive or incendiary payloads, intended to start forest fires, destroy infrastructure, and create panic among the civilian population. The engineering behind the Fugo balloons was remarkably sophisticated. Each balloon was over 30 feet in diameter and filled with hydrogen gas. A barometric altimeter controlled the release of ballast to maintain altitude, While a timer triggered the release of weapons and self-destruction mechanisms after approximately 60 to 80 hours of flight, the estimated time needed to cross the Pacific. The balloons ascended to altitudes of over 30,000 feet, where they caught the jet stream and traveled at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. Japan's strategic objective was psychological as much as physical. By demonstrating the ability to strike the American mainland with minimal resources, Japanese military planners hoped to divert Allied forces from the Pacific theater and create fear among American civilians. They also harbored hopes that the incendiaries would ignite massive wildfires in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, disrupting timber production critical to the Allied war effort. The campaign was a partial success. Over 1,000 balloons reached North America, landing in locations from Alaska to Mexico and as far east as Michigan. Most landed in remote areas and caused little damage. But on May 5, 1945, tragedy struck. A group of Sunday school children on a picnic near Bly, Oregon, discovered a balloon tangled in trees. When they approached it, the device exploded, killing 5 children and 1 adult, the only combat deaths on the American mainland during World War II. The American government's response was immediate and comprehensive. A total media blackout was imposed. Newspapers were prohibited from reporting on the balloon incidents, and citizens were instructed not to discuss any sightings. The strategy was deliberate. If Japan received no confirmation that the balloons were reaching their targets, they might conclude the program was failing and discontinue it. The blackout worked. Japanese intelligence, monitoring American radio broadcasts and newspapers, found no mention of balloon attacks. Concluding that the Fugo project was ineffective, Japan terminated the program in April 1945. But the threat was far more serious than the public ever knew. Declassified documents reveal that several balloons landed near critical infrastructure hydroelectric dams, military bases, and even the Manhattan Project site at Hanford, Washington, where plutonium for atomic bombs was being produced. One balloon caused a temporary power outage at Hanford by short-circuiting power lines, disrupting plutonium production for several hours. If Japan had known how close they came to interfering with America's atomic program, they might have intensified the campaign. After the war, American intelligence officers interrogated Japanese scientists and engineers involved in Fugo. The testimonies revealed that Japan had considered far more sinister payloads for the balloons, including biological weapons, specifically plague-infected fleas. Documents from Japan's notorious Unit 731, the Biological Warfare Research Division, indicate that experiments were conducted on balloon-borne dispersal of pathogens. Whether any biological payloads were actually launched remains unclear, but the possibility was real enough that American medical authorities quietly monitored for unusual disease outbreaks along the West Coast throughout 1945 and 46. The Fugo balloon bombs demonstrated that in modern warfare, distance is no longer a barrier. A nation with limited resources could strike an enemy homeland using nothing more than paper, hydrogen, and prevailing winds. The technology was primitive by contemporary standards, yet it achieved what no other Axis weapon could. It brought the war to the American heartland. After the war, the balloon bomb program was largely forgotten. The media blackout had been so effective that most Americans never learned the full extent of the attacks. The few remnants of Fugo balloons that survived were quietly collected and destroyed. The incident at Bly, Oregon, was acknowledged but downplayed. The deaths were attributed to an unexploded Japanese device, with no further details provided. It wasn't until the 1980s, when declassified documents became available, that the scope and sophistication of Project Fugo became widely known. Researchers discovered that Japan's balloon campaign had been more extensive, better designed, and far more dangerous than anyone had realized. If Japan had launched the balloons earlier in the war, or if they had equipped them with biological payloads, the consequences could have been catastrophic. The Fugo balloons proved that even the simplest technology, deployed with ingenuity and strategic intent, could threaten a superpower. And they revealed something even more unsettling: that the United States, despite its industrial might and technological superiority, was vulnerable to attack by an enemy willing to weaponize the very air itself. 10 World War II weapons, from Nazi Germany's Bell device and Horton's stealth fighter to Japan's death ray and balloon bombs, represent deliberately suppressed technologies that were too advanced for their era. These weren't failures. They were successes that threatened post-war narratives. Governments seized prototypes, classified documents, and recruited scientists through programs like Operation Paperclip. The The knowledge didn't vanish, it migrated into modern weapons programs. Today's inexplicable military technologies trace back to these hidden innovations. The pattern persists. Visionaries silenced, projects buried, evidence sealed. The real secret isn't what was destroyed, but what survived, evolved, and waits in classified vaults for future deployment.